I'm Shelagh Connor Shapiro, and I'm a member of the board of the Green Mountain Book Festival. I'm going to be moderating this nonfiction panel today, and I'm getting used to the idea of standing, so pardon me while I try to figure all this out. These four wonderful authors are going to be talking about nonfiction today, and I'm just going to do some quick introductions. I thought what I might do is introduce you one at a time and ask you each a question, and then go to the next introduction and question, so that we kind of break the introductions up a little bit. So I'm going to start with Sandra, who's sitting right near me here. Sandra Matthews, author of Occupying Massachusetts, Layers of History on Indigenous Land, which is published by George F. Thompson in association with the Center for the Study of Place. Sandra's photographs are in public collections, including the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Addison Gallery of American Art, Harvard University Art Museums, Smith College Museum of Art in Northampton, Henry Art Gallery, Block Museum of Art, and the Women in Photography International Archive at Yale University. In addition to Occupying Massachusetts, she has authored the photo book Present Moments and co-authored the critical history Pregnant Pictures. She's founding editor of the Trans Asia Photography Review and associate professor emerita at Hampshire College, Amherst, Massachusetts. And I'm going to start out by asking you the same thing I'm going to ask everybody, which is if you can just talk briefly about how this book started for you.
Well, the book is called Occupying Massachusetts, Layers of History on Indigenous Land, and I have been living in Massachusetts for more than 40 years, and I always had the feeling that I knew many people had been in the places where I was before me, and I had an experience visiting a historic house from colonial times, in which it seemed that American history started with the arrival of the British, and history that came before had been erased or suppressed. And I had been photographing architecture, buildings and structures on the land, which are forms of occupying land or laying a claim on land. And I started to look for visual evidence of indigenous structures. And so that's how it got started, that I just thought, I know this history is here. I know indigenous people are still here. More 100,000 people, indigenous people, still live in Massachusetts. And why does history seem to start with the British in the 1600s? So I'll just show you a couple quick pictures and then we'll move on.
That's great.
Okay. I got in touch with a local indigenous group and started to attend their meetings and learned about the ancient stone structures that are everywhere in Massachusetts. And this book is about Massachusetts, but it might apply to Vermont and everywhere in the United States in different ways as well. The specifics would be different, but that underlying story of occupation of indigenous land is an American story, is one of our original sins as Americans. So I found ancient stone structures, many of which are hidden for their own protection. So there are many more than any of us realize there, and people are working on that. I also found contemporary versions of traditional indigenous dwellings. This one might be hard to see. And the book is in the bookstore. There's an open copy if you want to take a closer look at the pictures. But this is an instance of tradition coming into the present, so a sense of history. So I'm interested in history here and thinking about history as not quite nonfiction because I also include historical markers.
Right, we're going to talk,
indigenous history, which are very subjective.
Yeah.
And of course, all history is very, very subjective.
Wonderful.
And that the idea of it as nonfiction doesn't quite resonate. And then the book includes a lot of structures that are not indigenous structures, but are on indigenous lands, and the captions of the photos then identify to the best of our ability, and this is the part of the research, which was fun to do, but challenging. So like the caption of this photo, which is of a shed with a dollhouse in it. I don't know if you can see it. The caption would be on Nipmuc and Petumkut homelands, Northampton, also known as Nonotuck. So I'm trying to give a double consciousness of places that they have contemporary names that may or may not be rooted in indigenous language. They have homelands, and if sometimes we know what their indigenous names were.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. I'm sorry if it's hard to hear. We have people in the front. I'm hearing music. Is there music playing? Oh, okay. Upstairs. Okay. All right. Well, we'll do our best. Maybe try to lean into your mics a little bit as best you can. All right.
It's a soundtrack.
I'm going to go next to Jessica Nordell, my housemate for the weekend. She's an award-winning author and science writer, known for blending rigorous science with compassionate humanity. Her book, The End of Bias, A Beginning, shortlisted for the 2022 Columbia Journalism Lucas Prize for Excellence in Nonfiction, the 2022 New York Public Library Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism, and the 2021 Royal Society Science Book Prize, is the culmination of 15 years of reporting and writing on the subject of bias and discrimination and how to solve it for publications including the New York Times, The Atlantic, and the New Republic. The End of Bias was named a Best Book of the Year by the World Economic Forum, Greater Good, AARP, and Inc., and is currently being used by organizations from newsrooms and startups to universities, healthcare organizations, and faith communities to solve some of their biggest cultural challenges. So Jessica Nordell, welcome. I wonder if you might answer that same question about how the book started for you.
Absolutely. So I'm a journalist. I'm a science writer, and I write primarily about bias and discrimination. And after many years of writing about it, I started to become a little bit impatient with journalism, because journalism, although it's an incredibly essential function in our society, and as a journalist, I'm a big fan of journalism, it has a narrow focus, which is exposing problems often, delineating wrongdoing and describing it and persuading people to care, persuading people that this is a problem. And after many years of doing this, I was dogged by the question, like, what do we do about this? Is it possible for people to change? Is there something we can do to ameliorate the damage that is caused by bias and discrimination in our society? And so this book is the outcome of this quest that I went on to really try to answer that question. Like, what interventions work? What approaches work? Is it possible for people to change? Are we just stuck with this? And I went on a very long journey. It took about 5.5, 6 years to write the book, to really try to answer that question. And so the book is sort of my attempt to answer and describe all of the different interventions and approaches and kind of solutions that I found that have some measurable impact on people's behavior and cause them to be more humane, more just, more fair toward one another. So that's kind of the origin story.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Brian Michael Murphy is the next person in line. Brian is the author of We, the Dead, Preserving Data at the End of the World, published by the University of North Carolina Press. He is the dean of the college at Bennington College, managing and nonfiction editor of Northwest Review, and director of the Kenyon Review Young Writers Workshop. Brian's essays and poems have appeared or are forthcoming in the Wall Street Journal, Lapham's Quarterly, Kenyon Review, Media and Narrative, and in Italian translation in Acoma. A Fulbright scholar, his work has also been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Vermont Arts Council, and the Ohio Arts Council. Brian, welcome.
Thank you. So this book began in about 2009. Can everybody hear me? I was doing my PhD a little bit, there we go. Is that better? I was doing my PhD and I was studying the history and theory of photography. And I stumbled upon this archive called the Bettman Archive, which was pretty well known, but I hadn't known about it. And I found out that Bill Gates had bought the Bettman Archive. It's about 14 million images, really iconic stuff, everything from Albert Einstein sticking out his tongue to, Marilyn Monroe standing on the sidewalk trying to hold her skirt down. And I was fascinated by the idea that Bill Gates owned these images privately and that you have to pay him to use them. But I was even more interested in the fact that he decided, because he'd spent millions of dollars on this, that he really needed to preserve it forever. So he hired someone to build a special facility, which ended up being basically a 10,000 square foot freezer, 220 feet underground in a former limestone mine in Pennsylvania at a place called the Iron Mountain National Data Center, which more or less rivals the security of like the Pentagon. So I thought, why would anybody do this? And he said that according to the science that they have to back up the design, these pictures frozen in this way would be preserved for 10,000 to 15,000 years. And I thought, why would anybody try to preserve anything for 15,000 years? And when did we start claiming that with scientific certainty that we could actually preserve these artifacts in that way? So that sent me on a journey, and then I ended up spending 5 years writing a dissertation on that topic, and then I spent 7 years rewriting it as something that people who weren't academics might want to read. So I tried to infuse as much narrative into it, and all of the archives that I went to, instead of just talking about what I found in the archive, in the book now, you're not really allowed to do this in academia, but in the version of the book that I wrote now, I actually narrate going to these archives and having to give my ID to an armed guard and having to have my car searched, because I actually went to the Iron Mountain National Data Center, 200 feet underground, and it's highly securitized. Somebody goes with you. If you need to go to the bathroom, they walk you to the door of the bathroom. All of your movements are tracked. And I was there to look at photographs. So I started writing about how this developed. But that's where it started. It started in school. But 10 years later, it became the book we have now.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. I have asked for a little bit of intervention from the librarians for a little quiet. Erik Shonstrom is the author of the recently released I Probably Should Have Brought a Tent, which is a memoir that recounts his misadventures as a wilderness instructor. He has written for numerous publications such as Los Angeles Review of Books and Essay Daily, and his work has been featured on Vermont Public Radio and in Forbes magazine. His other books include The Wisdom of the Body, The Indoor Epidemic, and Wild Curiosity. A professor at Champlain College. He lives in Vermont with his family. You can decide which book you want to talk about and how it was inspired. I am going to ask you some questions about both I Probably Should Have Brought a Tent and about The Wisdom of the Body. But
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for being here, everybody, on a beautiful Saturday. To be inside on a day like this in Vermont it's a real treat. So thanks for coming. I wrote the most recent book to get rich and live the posh author lifestyle, which I'm sure my fellow authors can agree. It's pretty amazing. The book actually came out of when I was about 9. I read My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George, and that was it for me. That was the book. I wanted to both live that book. For those of you that know, it's about a kid that runs away from home, lives in a hollow tree, and trains a falcon. Yeah, it is. And that is the sum total of my dream in life from the age of 9 till now, at almost 50. So I kind of tried to do that in various ways for many, many years as a wilderness guide. And then my previous book, The Wisdom of the Body, had the good fortune to be released in March of 2020, which is a great time to publicize a book and get out there on the road. So I really couldn't do much for that book, but I couldn't really do much of anything else either. So I started to take all those stories of me trying to sort of live into this dream I had of being out in the wilderness through the various jobs I've had working for Outward Bound and put them together in a book. So I spent the pandemic sort of writing up all these stories and trying to convince someone to publish them, which they did, which was great. So that's where that book came from.
wonderful. Fantastic. I want to ask a question about research. And Brian, you did talk a little bit about your experience of going to the Pennsylvania vault underground. So that was one research story I thought was pretty extraordinary. And I also was curious to ask Sandra, I keep saying your name wrong, about finding the markers. You know, you used 11 historical markers that are, I think, probably less than 10% of the markers that are in Massachusetts for these sorts of things. So how did you research where they all are and what you wanted to use for occupying Massachusetts? And then also, if anybody has any thoughts on their research process and any surprises that came up while you were researching that maybe took your book in a direction you didn't expect?
Well, research was one of the most enjoyable parts of working on this book. And interestingly, there are online databases of historical markers. And I had started by contacting local historical societies, and they told me about these databases. And then the databases also, people would, one thing led to another. They put me on historical listservs. People would write to me, tell me about other things, and then I would get an address for a marker or an approximate address, and finding it was often a challenge. So I would go and try to find these markers, and I photographed many, many more than are used in the books, but they're selected to kind of tell a story from different points of view.
Wonderful. And yeah, later I have a question about how you juxtapose them with photographs and how you use them to tell a story. But before we get to that, who else might want to say something about research?
You want to go first?
Well, I definitely had moments of surprise during the research for my book. I did a lot of traveling and meeting people all over the country and even all over the world that were working on this problem of trying to reduce bias. And one of the areas that I was really interested in was police bias and whether it's possible to change police behavior. It was really an open question to me, like, is it possible to create the kind of kindness, respect, care across police departments in the United States? And this was, I was doing the research in 2018, 2019. And one of the approaches that I was interested in was some work being done by some police departments in Oregon who were looking at kind of trying to introduce mind-body practices into police departments in order to allow police to show up in a state of calm and a state of decency and kindness toward the community. And so they were doing things like teaching police meditation and metta, like loving kindness meditation, mindfulness meditation. And they had some pilot studies that were pretty interesting. Like they showed that police were less aggressive, less angry, less prone to like emotional outbursts after doing this training. So I thought this is pretty interesting. So I went out to one of the trainings in Oregon, and it started out like it was sort of going along as planned. There were maybe 30 officers from all over the West Coast at this training. And about halfway through the training, it just completely went off the rails. There was a sort of a contingent of officers who'd been required to go there by their departments, and they like rebelled. And they were so angry at having to be there that they left the training before it was over. And so it was like this explosive like conclusion to this, reporting trip. I was like, this is not at all what I was expecting. At the same time, it seemed like really important information, that this happened. And so if you have a chance to take a look at the book, you'll see, this chapter where I kind of start out going to this training that I think is going to go one way, and then it just goes completely in the other direction. And then, I had to sort of make sense. Well, what does that say about this approach? Like, is it actually viable, sustainable? Maybe when it happens and people participate, it has positive outcomes. But if the people who are being invited to participate don't actually want to do it, then, what does that say about the viability? So that was like a surprising experience that I had that I then had to, sort of grapple with and incorporate into the overall arc of the book and my thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, the research process for me was, the whole thing was a process of me being taken in directions that I didn't foresee. I went to several archives spread out across the country. And I remember I had less than a year to finish my my dissertation, and I was talking to my advisor, and he was perfect for me because I was really, if you talked to me when I was 20, I was destined to do an MFA in poetry. I was like, that's what I'm doing. I'm gonna go to Iowa or NYU, and I'm gonna write poems, and I'm gonna drink wine, and I'm gonna hang out,
you got that
on
last
the
part.
grass. And at the last minute, because of a mentor, convinced me. I sort of swerved into the PhD path, and it was the right path. But my advisor guiding my research was really also an artist. He was like a songwriter. He'd been in a band in Austin, Texas in the 70s. There are like photos in his house from like he's at the first South by Southwest. It was like 200 people in a softball tournament and some music. But anyway, it was great for me because I was always trying to navigate this research side where you have to have a piece of evidence to support every claim you make, and the poetry side where you can basically do whatever you want. And he was talking to me. I had less than a year to finish, and I was stressed out because I was like, if I do this like archival research-based thing, I'm going to be like traveling all these places. It's going to be really hard. I was like, what if I just like don't do that? What if I just kind of, write something simpler? And he was like, I would really encourage you to go to the archives. I was like, okay. I was like, why? He said, well, because you're going to go there and you're going to find this amazing stuff you never would have thought existed, and it's going to completely ruin your argument. I said, aren't you the same guy that said I have to be done in the next 9 months? He's like, yeah. He's like, but it's going to ruin your argument. You're going to regroup, and then your argument's going to get better, and it's going to get smarter, and it's going to be richer. And I think he was right. I think he was right, to let yourself be destabilized. Let yourself be completely thrown off. Let yourself be like, what am I going to do now? And then just listen to the research that you find and go in the directions, and it makes the project more authentic. I think, just real quick, if I can add one more thing. Another thing about it was I would go to these archives, and as a scholar, I was really trained to get these artifacts and write about them. But as I'd be sitting, like I'm sitting in like a limestone cave 200 feet underground, and I'm like, this is also very interesting. Why can't I write about this? And luckily, I was in a department where they allowed me to actually not just analyze the artifact, but tell the story of what I had to do to get to the artifact, and then think about all the layers that go into a facility like that existing, right? Because there's the Cold War history of when it was a bomb-proof bunker for corporate records before it became a photo preservation facility. But there's also the history sort of going back even deeper of like indigenous people being there. And there's also the history of, limestone is the accumulated skeletons of like oceanic life. Like Pennsylvania was covered by an ocean. So all those skeletons, like coral, they compress together into that white rock. So there's also a 300 million year history in that room that I was in that provided the sanctum for these photos. So I was able to go into all of that. But I only was able to do that because I wasn't rigid, and I wasn't married to my argument in a way that was protective. You've got to just let it get completely obliterated, and then more interesting stuff will happen. It's not efficient at all.
No.
And it's really hard, but I think it ended up being much more enjoyable that way too.
It's interesting because it sounds a little bit like that's what happened to you, Jessica.
Yeah, I'm like finding myself nodding absolutely over and over. Like I would, have an idea, have an argument I was trying to make, and then do research that totally upended my argument, and then I'd have. But you're right; it makes it so much richer because you're drawing on more of reality in order to actually try to make a case for something.
I think it goes even further than that, though, because the nonfiction books I've written that have been research based, you can research something for a really long time because you become sort of obsessed with it. You just kind of get this tunnel vision. You're like, this is going to be amazing for me. I wrote a book. The Indoor Epidemic was about how the outdoors helps us learn. And for a while, I was on this thing. Someone had told me once that there was these schools in Austria where they made kids do PE naked. And I was like, that's crazy. And I got into this like outdoor naked PE thing for like a good 2 weeks. Like I was researching it and calling people. And then I sent some stuff to my editor. I was like, what do you think about this? And she wrote back a one-word email, no. She was like, what does this have to do with anything that you're talking about? And I think that happens to everyone, right? Like you just get this tunnel vision, limestone cavern vision, whatever you want to call it. And you like get stuck in this thing. But I think that even though that's 80% of what you're doing and it's mostly not to be used, it's still useful in some way. Maybe just because you feel like you're being proactive and getting stuff done. I don't know. But I think that's actually part of it, that you have to be willing to just sort of go down these ridiculous rabbit holes knowing that they're never going to come to fruition and never see the light of day.
If you're working under deadline, that must be really terrifying. Does that happen, or are you not mostly working under deadline in these situations?
In my experience, there were a lot of deadlines. Yes. But you have to, in my experience, I had to find ways to stay motivated. And it's that obsession that sits me down at the desk the next day. Like, what am I going to find? So being able to take a week or two detour just to stay in the work is worthwhile. And you don't know it when you're researching it. You're like, oh, this is going to be the greatest book ever on naked PE, and this is going to be my opening chapter. You actually, because you're completely delusional. Like you think like my editor's
exactly.
gonna. You thought that email was going to be very different.
Oh, I thought she was gonna be like, this is actually your book. Like, no one's written about this. And the reason no one's written about it is like, no one cares. Like, except for me in my basement by myself for those 2 weeks. Yeah.
So you don't know it's a rabbit hole that is not going to come to fruition until it's too late and you've already gone down it. So
Right. This sort of follows on, I think, to the research question, which is what each of you sees as the requirements necessary to write about a given subject. So all of you are artists, but have also backgrounds in other areas. So Brian is a media archaeologist, something Ron Charles was super excited about in his review. Erik writes about everything from creativity to embodied cognition. Sandra is a photographer, but your subjects vary from women's health and pregnancy to colonialism. Jessica is a science and cultural journalist. So what is necessary? What do you think are the required, the requirements to be able to write about a subject and be, believed by your reader or trusted by your reader?
I could just jump. How about the desire to figure things out
Okay.
is the starting point for me.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, but I also think I think there needs to be a sort of central organizing question or sort of, again, I'll use the word obsession that you have, that you just can't let it go. You keep asking the question. So I think expertise is really helpful, but I'm sure everybody would, like, expertise can also be blinders, right? Expertise in a specific discipline can kind of, there is sort of a structure that is expected. If you're going to write about whatever you're going to write about, colonial history, there's a kind of way you're supposed to do it, right? That everybody thinks. And if you are outside of that and you're somewhat of a gate crasher, that can actually sometimes be helpful because you have to come at everything fresh, right? I don't know. So I wrote a book on embodied cognition. I literally had no idea what that phrase even meant, before I started writing the book. I just read about it and it got me going. So you have to learn everything from the ground up, and that enables you to kind of have, I think, a really interesting sort of new approach to writing about that topic. So I think it's the willingness to be sort of have that, beginner's mind is really important, and to be really uninformed about certain aspects of your topic and accept that and not assume that you know and just go into it anyway and keep learning and learning. So I think that's
Great.
There's some humility there, maybe stupidity as well, but like definitely some humility for sure.
Okay. Great.
I mean, I think there are a lot of different kinds of writing, and they each have their own conventions, and they each have their own demands in terms of the amount of evidence you need to marshal. I mean, journalism to scholarly writing, they have different sense of like what kinds of evidence count. But what I would say is, what you really need is other people. In order to figure out if it's working and if it's convincing, and if you have made an argument or a claim that you've actually backed up enough, other people will tell you. Sometimes it's your editor. Sometimes maybe you have a friend who reads for you. Sometimes you have a writing group, and they'll say, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I also want that to be true, but is it actually true? And the only thing you've said that to convince me is this like one person's story, right? And so maybe you go out and you get more evidence and you find that it is true or it isn't, or maybe you start writing about this feeling that seems to be going around, where people want this thing to be true. We don't know if it is. And where does that desire come from? Yeah. And why do we all feel so powerfully that we want this thing to be true, and we tell each other it's true, even when we know it might not be? So what I'm saying is there are all kinds of ways, like if you find that you're making an argument or saying something that somebody says you're not expert enough to say that, or you don't, who are you to make that claim? There are all kinds of ways of sort of like swimming around that. You don't have to just say, okay, well, I can't talk about that. You can do anything you want. Just bounce it off of other people, and they will help you figure out if it's working or not. And I don't know how to do that on my own. There's no way that I would ever figure that out on my own without other people telling me.
These are all such great answers. I feel like I'm learning a lot from all of you. I would add naivete is really helpful.
Oh yeah.
I went into this project having no idea how hard it would be, and it's about halfway through. I remember I was interviewing a very esteemed academic psychologist, and he said, oh yeah, I thought about writing a book like this, but I decided it would be too hard. And I think also for me, I would add paranoia was very helpful, because as a gatecrasher, someone who's not an academic, writing a very kind of science, rigorous, sort of scientifically based book, I was paranoid that I was maybe that I could misrepresent the research, or that I could, there could be a big gap that I didn't see. And so I think that paranoia drove a lot of my rigor and kind of assiduousness in the research and reporting. And then I think also, something else that was helpful for me was a certain humility about not having to have all of the answers. Like there were definitely moments where I came up against a tension that I could not resolve. And through earlier in the process, I thought, well, it's my job to resolve this tension for the reader and to give them an answer. And at some point, I decided that when I came up against some of those tensions, that it was actually okay to talk about those on the page and to be very honest and open with the reader about what I was struggling with. And just to give you an example, one of those tensions for me is the tension between, on one hand, the importance of acknowledging and recognizing group differences and social identities. It's absolutely essential, for us to grapple with and understand all of the social identities that matter in our culture. And on the other hand, focusing a lot on social identities can lead to the hardening of group boundaries and the reinforcing of stereotypes, which leads to discrimination and prejudice. And that is like a real tension that I still struggle with, that I still grapple with, that I haven't totally resolved. And I just decided that it was okay to actually just talk about that and invite the reader into that conversation, and that I didn't have to actually resolve it for the reader.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple questions and put them together. I think they relate, and I think it offers a way for Sandra to jump in. I wanted to ask about navigating liability in writing nonfiction, which is something I think Jessica kind of just touched on with her paranoia moment. And for example, in your book, Jessica, you write about the physician Uche Blackstock, who found medicine full of misogyny and prejudice, but kept quiet because she loved her work and the students she mentored. But you don't name that university, I think. So I wondered if that had to do with liability. I'd open that up to anybody. And then the other question I was going to ask, Sandra's publisher is in association with the Center for the Study of Place. And I did have a question about, what about when you have an organization or an individual that's supporting your work, and I'm not saying that they did this to you, but what do you do if anybody has designs on what you should be writing and what you should be doing? So I think those are two kind of maybe interrelated questions, or just pick one. So. And if you don't feel like going first, anybody can jump in.
It'd be great if someone else could jump in.
Okay. You wanna?
That's all you do.
So let's see here. Liability. There's a great organization called the Authors Guild that has an amazing set of resources, and they have lawyers as well. My general advice would be, if you're concerned about something, look into it. Don't keep writing and don't get all the way to the book coming out and be nervous. I think there's also insurance you can buy if you're really that worried. There's insurance you can buy, in case you get sued. I know this is getting really boring really fast, but these things are out there. And the Authors Guild has great resources on that. But what I would say, from my personal experience, I'm writing about. Basically, I write about, Bill Gates in my book. I write about Elon Musk. I write about Jeff Bezos. So basically, like, over the past 10 years, the richest person on the planet, I'm writing about them. I'm making fun of them. I'm saying that what they're doing is kind of ridiculous. And I think, your editor and your publisher should sort of help you navigate that. I definitely asked some questions of my editor and said, are we okay here and there? And, he was very experienced, and he'd worked on the trade side, and he said, I think we're okay. So that made me feel better. But, again, you sort of got to rely on other people to help figure out where you sit. That's how I navigated it. But I had a very strong relationship with my editor and publisher, and I trusted their knowledge and expertise. And they're very well established, so I know that they're very serious about that, and they wouldn't give me a flippant response like, "Yeah, it's fine, don't worry." They take it very, very seriously. So it's definitely a team effort.
The car alarm is new.
I think that there's another piece too where you can just, if you're writing about a person specifically, oftentimes, at least what I've done at least a couple times, is I just reach directly out to that person.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll say, look, I'm going to send you the draft of what I've written about either your work or what you've said. And what I always say is there anything that's untrue? Don't tell me whether you like it or not, because I know you're not going to like it. But just tell me, is there anything that's untrue? And they can then either respond or not. And I've even written about family members and had to do that. Like, hey, Dad, how's it going? Just a heads up, this is coming out, and what do you think? Is this how you remember it? Because I think that's important. One of the things that I'm somewhat of a stickler on, I know that there's a lot of sort of nonfiction writers, especially now. There's sort of a sort of very hip cutting edge of nonfiction where there's sort of a blending with fiction. And I think that there's a lot of folks who do that. I do not do that for the simple reason that, I was a journalist for a while, and that was imprinted on me pretty strongly that you should try to be as accurate as possible. So I've reached out to folks before and said, is this how you remember it? Is this what you remember people saying? And generally I've found that people either do one of two things. They either say yes, or they ignore you.
Yeah.
In which case you've done due diligence, and I think you can feel at least somewhat okay about moving ahead. So at least in terms of individuals, not institutions so much, but individuals, I always just try to ask if I think it's going to be an issue. And I either get ignored or a response.
Great.
I could just mention a small example. There's a map in my book, and it was the publisher's idea to make this map. It's a map of indigenous homelands at the time of European contact in the early 1600s. And it turned out to be really difficult to come up with a map that would please everybody. And we had several indigenous consultants who worked with us who said, no, the boundaries are not clear, and different groups shared the homelands, and people moved back and forth in and out of the homelands, and you just can't do that. And mapping is it is a Western idea to begin with, this kind of mapping. And so we went back and forth and around with indigenous consultants and with historians of other kinds, and we finally came up with something that was at least acceptable to everyone. I don't know that everyone loved it, and this is just our small group, so there might still be other people who could take issue with it, and that's fine. We've said we're doing it to the best of our ability in consultation, and what we did is we blurred the lines between the homelands and used sort of pale colors to have things overlap, and so it worked, but it was a long process.
Wonderful. Yeah, that must have been challenging.
Can I add something to that that's related? Do we have time?
Yeah,
Real quick?
absolutely.
Okay.
And then Jessica's going to say something too.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You go first.
Well, I mean, that is so interesting, the idea of blurring the boundaries. I feel like, I don't know if other people, if my fellow panelists came to this point, but there was definitely a point in my process where I was like, how can you ever know if anything is true? Did you come to that?
Right.
It just there's, a fact can be sort of exploded into so many different components, and it's almost impossible to know whether something is actually true. So, I mean, I hired fact checkers. I hired my own fact checkers who spent about 4 months fact checking my book, and they found things that, they found biographical details about people that I had interviewed that those people didn't remember, or that they had gotten wrong about their own lives. So that was helpful and awkward at times. But I'm curious to hear what you were going to say.
Well, I was just going to say, if you're using images or illustrations in your book, get permission from whoever owns those, and know that there are certain archives or certain commercial licensing companies that will claim to own the rights for something and try to charge you $600 to use it. But they actually don't own the rights. This happens a lot. So be careful about that. And one of the ways that liability can come up, say if you're using an image that belongs to a corporation, they will send an agreement along with that image, and it'll say things like, whatever book you put this in cannot disparage in any way or tarnish the corporate brand of, Nabisco or whatever. And so that's just another thing to be attentive to. So if you get an image licensed for use, don't just like sign the agreement. Like, make sure you understand what's in it, and let your publisher look at it and consult a lawyer if you need to. In part because you just want to have a good relationship with whoever is becoming a part of your project, and also because you can rest a little more peacefully knowing that you did your due diligence.
Fabulous. I'm just looking at my watch and realizing I have like 107 more questions. But I don't want to neglect to ask the audience if they have questions for you all. So I can start there. Yes. And I'm just gonna repeat it a little bit for people who couldn't hear. So it's a question about bias, about Israel, and about the federal government coming down on UVM, and about anti-Semitism and whether that is intermingled with anti-Semitism. And I assume you heard the question, so you can probably, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was actually just talking about this 2 days ago with a friend of mine who's a professor of Jewish studies, who's dealing with this as well. And it's really thorny. I mean, I agree with you. Like, you can criticize the policies of a nation without criticizing or without, resorting to anti-Semitism. But I think that the challenge and why it's so complicated is that those are often intermingled in a way that is difficult to pull apart, and sometimes I think, I'm Jewish actually myself, and I think, that what Jews find is that sometimes the criticism of Israel is informed by anti-Semitism in a way that is not examined fully, or it may be unconscious. I mean, my book is about unconscious bias, unexamined sort of prejudices based on inherited toxic ideas and lies in many cases, and stereotypes. And so I think that, the reason that it's such a thorny issue is that sometimes the political and the personal or the stereotypical are intermingled in ways that are hard to unscramble. And I would love, at some point to learn more about what's going on at UVM. I'm not familiar with the specific situation.
Does anybody else have a question for the panel? I do have. I wanted to talk a little bit about tone and establishing a tone. We have a few more minutes. Erik, do you mind if I read something from your book?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Just $10
Okay.
per minute is what I usually charge.
I'll see you after. I'll see you after.
That's fine. Venmo.
All right.
Yeah.
So this is, I think Erik does a fabulous job of mixing subject matter, background, reaction, and humor. There's a lot of humor. So here, Florida being Florida is the locale for at least one exception to the rule of violent European colonial dispossession of native culture and lives. I felt like this kind of overlaps a lot here. It's home to the Seminole people, the only tribe that never officially surrendered in the face of the U.S. pogroms of the 19th century that attempted to wipe out native populations. Eventually, the U.S. military just gave up hunting down the indigenous peoples of Florida who had taken refuge in the impenetrable swamps. If there is a geographical equivalent to giving the middle finger, it is Florida. I enjoy that, but it made me think about tone and figuring out what tone you're going to use. I mean, that's a serious subject that you were tackling, and yet you did a lovely job of making it also I don't know, appropriately light, and I didn't find it inappropriate. So why don't you start, if you wouldn't mind, talking about tone? And you are very humorous in your writing, so is there ever time that you have to pull it back? What do you think?
It was the central sort of concern I had about the book, because here's the reality, just to be completely transparent. I am a 6'3", very privileged white guy, right? And I wanted to write the story about being out in the wilderness and how transcendent it was for me and how great it was. But sort of to what you've been writing about and working on, that's not my wilderness, right? It was de-peopled for me through the efforts of hundreds of years of colonialism. So that was a background that I wanted to be honest about. And I felt uncomfortable just sort of pulling a John Muir and being like, the empty, unpeopled landscape. Well, it's unpeopled for a reason, because of smallpox blankets. I really struggled with that, but I also wanted to write a funny book. Mm-hmm. And so that was a constant source of tension that, when I say tension, it was just me sitting there is this okay? Is it okay to try to tell a funny, interesting, humorous story, but at the same time, be honest about the reality of these spaces and be honest about the reality around outdoor wilderness culture and outdoor experiences, that it's, things are changing, but it's generally seen as white. It's generally seen as privilege, and the indigenous experience is almost always invisible in that story. So how do I do that? And so I think that I never really landed on this is how you do it, but it's a very sort of boring answer, but every single sentence in which I was doing that, I was trying to think is this weighted right? And I'm sure I screwed up plenty of times in the book where I was maybe a little bit too flip when I shouldn't have been, or too boring and serious where I should have injected a little bit more. But I think it comes down to just a sentence by sentence. I wish I had a fancy answer where you're just is this weighted right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And you just kind of keep moving through. And that's how you tried to approach the tone. Because I didn't want to give up either of those aspects of the book, because they were both really important to me.
It sounds like your answer is being careful.
Yeah, and taking your time.
Frivolous.
I think it's being slow and and then willing to strike out stuff. I had whole paragraphs and chapters that I just dumped because I was that's not working.
Wonderful, thank you. I can't see my watch. What time is it? It's pretty much time, I'm sorry to say, but I want to thank you all for being here and for speaking to us today, and thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.